Hello and welcome to Tatparya Books. We're going to do something different today. So I'm recording this in March of 2022, and last month in February of 2022, Russia attacked Ukraine. And this obviously became the most prominent news all over the world. Everyone had either an opinion about why Russia did this or wanted to know what is their motivation behind this move. And I thought this would be a good idea to maybe talk about what books can give us about current affairs. Now, when you pick up a book or when you want to know something about what is happening in the world in the current affairs, there are two things you really want to know. You want to know the why and you want to know the who. Why did this happen? What are the motivations of the main people behind it? And who are those main people behind some events that are happening right now? So now you could get this information from a TV program or a YouTube video, which is a 15-minute commitment. But when you pick up a book, you're probably going to make a 1 week commitment. It's about 500 pages long, and you really want to dig in and understand in depth about the situation. And so this obviously means that a book should be able to give you that information, but also at the same time hold your attention for that entire week. So the way I went about finding out about this situation was I picked up the first book that came up on Amazon. And it says it's a Sunday Times bestseller, and this is Putin's People by Belton. It's also reviewed by Peter Frankopan and Jen Salai, people I appreciate when I'm, in authors that I appreciate. So let's get into this book. But before I actually get into this book, I want to call your attention to the cover of this book. So you see it has a picture of Putin's eyes. And this, if for some of you who might remember it, is a reference to George W. Bush's meeting with Putin back in 2001, when he famously said he looked into his eyes and looked into his soul. So I think in a way the book is sort of showing us his eyes and telling us we're going to give you a glimpse into his soul. So now coming to the book, Jen Salai, very quickly, Catherine Belton is a Reuters reporter who has covered Russia for a very long period of time. She's won many awards for her coverage, and this book is no different. Now, the book is called Putin's People. So the first thing you might want to remember is that it is not a life story. It's not Putin's life story. It doesn't tell us every little detail about where he was born, which school did he go to, what his parents were like, what was his relationship with his father. No, it's not about that at all. It in fact doesn't even mention the fact that he got married or when did he get married, when did he have his children, none of it. It is a book about Putin and in his people, who are mostly men, and there are a lot of people covered in the book. After a little while, I kind of lost track of all the names that were being mentioned in the book. You remember the main people, the main players, but it just is very comprehensive in the people that it covers. It also covers the period from 1980s to the era of Donald Trump. The book was published in 2020, so it doesn't really cover the current Ukraine crisis or the immediate aftermath or just before the crisis. But it does give us a very good idea about Putin's motivations and Russia's motivations for getting into Ukraine. And the book, since it was written in 2020, around the time that Donald Trump was getting a lot of flack for his relationship with Putin, this kind of covers a little bit of that in depth. Now, before you get into the book, there are some assumptions that the book makes and that you should be aware of. So the book assumes that you would know these terms. You would know what is KGB. You would know what is the collapse and when did the collapse of USSR happen. So a lot of details about USSR and Russia in the last 20 years or 30 years and a period just before that is assumed. The author assumes that you know about that. So if you don't have any idea about what KGB is, I suggest you probably read up on that before you come to this book, because she doesn't take the pains to mention or give you any background about KGB. It also talks about Stalin and his purge and details which happened in the 1950s. Now, you don't really need to know everything about Stalin and communist Russia, but you do need to get a sense of how Russia and communist Russia operated in the 50s and 60s and 70s prior to Putin's rise. And that's going to be important. So these are the assumptions that the book makes. Now, coming to the book itself, and the writing is detailed. It like I mentioned, it covers all of Putin's people, and it covers them in detail. It begins in Dresden, with Putin being in Dresden, posted as a KGB officer in Dresden, an event that is often mentioned in his biographies, but not to the level of detail that she talks about here. She's giving you every little detail about who he was working with, who he was, I must correct that, who he was probably working with, because a lot about Putin is hidden in secrecy or lost. But she manages to uncover a lot of details right from Dresden to St. Petersburg to Moscow and his role in the world right now. So it is a very detailed account, and it's filled with lots of details of places and people and their habits and etc. It is well researched, and Belton is a very important journalist, a very well-respected journalist, and so obviously you can expect her to have researched her subject really well. So there is a lot of research done, there are lots of interviews conducted with some of the important players, and I'll come to that a little bit later, and a lot of information about the background of Russia in those years right after the collapse. And the one problem I did have with the book, and this probably stays throughout the book, is the book doesn't have a very followable narrative. So what I mean by that is it jumps around quite a bit. So you typically when you're reading a book like this, and there is a important person who comes into the picture, you expect the author to give you a little bit of a background about that person. Where did he come from? What is his habit like? Get you a sense, be in the room with that person before they talk about how they influenced the world or influenced some events. But here you just begin with the event and you learn about that person as you go along. Maybe this is a journalistic way of uncovering something. I mean, you're uncovering the story along with the journalist while it happens, but it's also a little disconcerting in the sense that after a while you're like, where am I actually? What is happening here? So that can be a little disconcerting, but if you can bear with that, I think it has a lot of information that you might find useful. So that's about the writing. Now, the main protagonist of the book, Putin. Let's come to that. And what does the book really offer you about Putin? Now, this is going to be a little difficult for me to cover this without really giving away a whole lot of the book. But what I will tell you is that the book covers Putin through other people's eyes. So you never hear from Putin directly except when she's quoting his speeches or some of the interviews that he has done. There are no direct interviews that she has conducted with Putin for the book, obviously. So you have a glimpse of Putin in his office, Putin at his home, observed by other people. So there you don't see him, you don't talk to him directly. So this is a view of Putin as seen by other people. And those other people, for most part, are defectors. Now, what I mean by that is these are people who are no longer close to Putin. They might have been once close to Putin, but they have now since defected. So this might be a one-sided view of Putin. There is a good chance that this is a one-sided view of Putin. Because if you are somebody who has defected away from him in the recent past, you probably don't have very nice things to say about him. So you need to keep that in mind when you're reading this book. It covers in detail everything in his life pre-2000 when he became the president of Russia and post-presidency. And this is a very interesting trajectory for us to observe because there is clearly a change in his character once he becomes a president. And pre-2000, he was known to be a very quiet guy who got the job done, who really didn't make his presence felt in any which way, and more probably even known as Yeltsin's man. But post becoming a president, you have a very self-assertive, quietly assertive Putin, who is very aware of what he wants to do. Now, I would argue when I was reading the book that this is not a change that happened after 2000, but he was always quietly assertive. and he knew what he wanted, where he wanted to go with his life, what his ambitions were. Maybe he didn't expect to be the president, but he definitely was a very ambitious man. But you also kind of get a sense of the fact that Putin has an ability to deceive himself. He's self-deceptive. What I mean by that is there are some incidents which are narrated in the book where where Putin really likes people to praise him, wants to get the best thing, best house out there, or wants to build the biggest castle in Russia. So there is a sense that he has a tendency to self-deceive himself. So an important event that happens right after his presidency, or a little into his presidency, is an attack on school in Belton. And there Putin somehow convinces himself that it's not really his fault, that the West somehow manufactured this attack and wants to bring him down. So there is a tendency in him to be self-deceptive, and that, I think, is a very important factor for us to consider when you consider the current events that are happening. It also sort of leads us into why he had to cultivate a relationship with Donald Trump, if he cultivated a relationship with Donald Trump, and what he thinks or what he expects from an attack in Ukraine. So Putin, as somebody who knows where he wants to go, along with his self-deceptive nature, thinks of the West as being an enemy and somebody who is meddling with his country and his right to rule the country. So he feels that it is absolutely fine for him to do the same in other countries. So it gives us a sense. Now I'm obviously reducing this to a large extent because I'm giving a summary of events, but the book really gives us an insight into what he's thinking when he gets into these situations. I really found the chapters about control of press and oil very, very interesting. So right after Putin comes to power in 2000, he immediately takes control of the press. It's like, I think it's in about 6 or 7 months time, or maybe in the first 1 year, immediately takes control of the press. It gives you a sense of a man who wants to control his narrative, who wants to tell the story his way. He doesn't like people questioning him. He doesn't like people going against him. And then he also realizes what is important for him, because Russia mostly depends on oil and oil resources for its foreign reserves and currency reserves. And so Putin very quickly also takes over the oil empire. If not directly, through his men, Putin's men, he takes over the oil empire or oil reserves of Russia, which were at that point falling into the hands of the oligarchs. You still have oligarchs, but most of those oligarchs are Putin's men. There was a very interesting episode of a person called Khodorkovsky, if I'm getting it right. He was an oil baron who owned a whole lot of resources in Russia, and he then thinks that he can somehow control Putin. And there is a very interesting meeting where he's criticizing Putin, and Putin just very quietly observes that in about 3 months' time, Khodorkovsky has lost his empire and everything is taken over by Putin. So I really found that episode very insightful into the kind of person that Putin was. You also get an idea in the way that Putin deals with the Chechenian war, that what is important for him, because there is in every incident, and this might be something that Catherine Belton is affected by talking just to defectors, but in every incident with the war in Chechnya, the way it's narrated is that this is what happened, and there was an attack in Moscow by Chechenian rebels, there is an attack on the school in Belton, but was it really Chechen rebels, or was it somebody else related to Putin? So there is always a sense with Putin about what is actually happening. You don't really know the truth with him, at least from reading this book. Now, the most important question, it's not the most important question, the often asked question about Putin that gets asked is he a Czar? Now, if you don't know, the Czar was a ruler of Russia before the 1918 revolution, and Russia typically has always had one strong ruler, and be it Peter the Great or Catherine the Great or even Stalin for that matter. So Russia has a tendency to be ruled by a strong ruler. And so the question is Putin a Tsar? Because he represents, or he tries to represent everything, all the features of being a Tsar, or is he a KGB man, a man who who exists in the shadows, doesn't tell about his motives, doesn't want to know anybody, he doesn't want anybody to know what he's thinking, where he's going with his strategy. The question is never really resolved. I think he's both, somewhere between the two, or he's both of them put together. So the book overall does give you a very good idea about Putin. So does the book tell you about Putin? Like as you might have noticed in what I've already said, it gives you a very good idea about Putin. But this is a one-sided view. You must remember that, and it is a view of Putin by others. There is not much that you hear directly from him. You get a very good idea about his people. I've already mentioned that. You get to know a lot of his people. Who are these people? How do they operate? How have they gained control? And how does the system actually work? You also get a very good idea about the current situation. There are a couple of chapters where we talk about Putin's capture of parts of Georgia, his capture of Crimea, and what is his interest in Ukraine. So there is a lot of information which is available on that. But you should also remember that the book concentrates a little bit more on Putin and Donald Trump and that relationship. It also talks a little bit, does it talk? Or yes, it does talk a little bit about Russia and the world. You cannot talk about Putin and the presidency without having to give some insight into what is his place in the world and how did he operate in the world? How did he see the world? It talks in great detail about his influence and money. There are chapters, there's one really interesting chapter which talks about how Putin and his men move their money around all over the world. So this is very good information for somebody who might be interested in anti-money laundering or how that is being done. So there are these cases that the author presents about how they move money out of Russia and how they keep it in all these places in banks which can be used in those countries. This is a system which the author thinks was first made by the KGB and then now exploited by Putin, who was a part of KGB. It doesn't tell us anything much about the army of Russia or the military tactics of Russia or Putin's military tactics, because a lot of it is covering everything pre-war period, and so we don't really get a sense of how the Ukraine war is going to unfold. So overall, the book manages to tell you all these things. Now, so the conclusion, what did I take away from the book? What I took away from the book, from this one-sided view from defectors, is that Putin really comes across as a little bit devious. He comes across shifty, and you don't really know where you are with him. To George Bush's statement about him looking into his eyes and then looking into his soul, I don't know what he saw, but from the book at least you get a sense that you cannot really trust this man here, what he's going to do, where he's going to do. So he comes across as a loyal of Yeltsin, Boris Yeltsin, the previous president of Russia, and then turns around once he gets the presidency, turns around and just ignores him or takes over his empire. So you don't really know who he's loyal to or what he's loyal to. Maybe he's loyal to Russia as an idea, or maybe he's just following his own ambition. There is, he just comes across as a devious, shifty, secretive person. And everything with him comes across as pre-planned. And this is something that I found a little annoying in the book a little bit, because every incident seems to have been pre-planned by Putin. So there is a sense that you cannot really believe anything that is happening, and that everything is planned by him. He controls everything. He knows what is happening. So you're really never going to be in control of that situation because he has already planned it all. I don't think it's that he's that efficient, but that's the impression you get in the book, and that kind of leads me to, it is a depressing read because of that, because you when you're reading all of these incidents and you're reading about people in Russia, you feel sorry for them. You feel like they've been manipulated all throughout the time, and that if you were in that situation, you probably would have been manipulated too. And so there is a certain depression that sets in because you're not in control of a situation, nobody's in control of a situation, everything is controlled by Putin. But nevertheless, it is useful information. It is a lot of information which is useful. So overall, I think it's a great read. It's a little difficult to read if you don't understand the basics or the background of Russia and why Russia is the way it is. But I do recommend that you check out Putin's People by Catherine Belton. And thank you for watching Tatparya Books.